So in this video, I'm going to show you how to just get started in Substance Designer. Over here you see this is your Explorer area. This is where your files are going to get loaded into, your SBS files. You're going to be saving from here and exporting your archive files to be used in Unreal Engine. Over here is your library. You may want to come over here and click and drag some items out of it, but for the most part we're going to be using the spacebar function. Down here is your 3D view. You'll have a 2D view to view your texture laid out flat, much like Substance Painter has it set up. And over here is going to be where your properties and the details of each node will pop up. So from there, we're going to right click, create new package under the Explorer. Now this is your actual SBS file. Go ahead and do save as. I'm going to actually save as tiles. I'm going to do new substance graph. Make sure you select the PBR metallic roughness. Come over here. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to name it tiles. I only want to see one graph per file. So I'll receive 5 SBS files from you guys, and you're only going to have one graph per file. So in here, you can tailor at 4K textures, but for the most part, I only want to see like 1K or 2K textures put into Unreal. We can tailor these after the fact. It's great to work high and then we can export low. So for the purpose of this demo, I'm only going to do 2K textures. Now if you look down here, these are all the maps that are going to be exported from this actual file because we're working on the PBR workflow. Now these are all the ones that we need output wise that we'll need for games. You won't really need to work outside of these outputs. So go ahead and just hit OK. Once your graph loads, you'll notice on the right side, these nodes are actually your outputs. These are what's going to save to an actual TGA if you do an export bitmap. They're also what you'll see in the end file, the archive file, for when we import into Unreal. They kindly put these in there. If you notice, and I go ahead and delete these, you can't see anything in your 3D view, so they put those just to start up with. We don't need them. So what we're going to go ahead and do is in an empty space back here, just hit the space bar, and we're going to look for base material. All right. Once that imports, I want you to come up to, I call them noodles. You just change your noodle out to a material and just drag one in, and it'll automatically figure out which one it belongs to. And that'll override these. So let's just get rid of these. Actually, move that out of the way. Grab these and just delete them. Now what the base material does, you can change your workflow in the PBR workflow technically. You can do dielectric, which is primarily what we're going to do, and it automatically controls your metallic in a sense. There are other options. If you want to go gold, it'll change your base color as well as, you know, the roughness of the material, how it thinks gold should look like, and then you can work from there. But for the most part, we're going to be working in dielectric. Dielectric. And then from there, we're going to adjust these user-defined maps. We don't want to always use everything this outputs, and in the end, most of this stuff won't be used. But what the base node also, or the base material also does, is it helps us keep within those value ranges. So we're going to pass through our height map. Generally, when you're building materials in Substance Designer, you kind of work in a like a process. You're going to sculpt your forms first, and you're going to sculpt from high to low, and then from there you might work on your metallic. So if we have anything that's like a screw or anything metallic, objects that are popping through our texture, we'll do a metallic pass, and then probably go for a roughness. We can tell things that are smooth or worn out, things that are really granular, matte, kind of describes, that surface quality. From there, we'll probably work on our base color. We'll use the maps for like the height to kind of guide us where we want our colors on different objects within the material in general. And then ambient occlusion, I kind of work with that hand in hand with the height. It just makes it easier because it'll really pop out those forms for me. So you can go ahead and turn that on. So don't worry, it went black. It's because we're not inputting it, our ambient occlusion, and off the bat it thinks just everything's black. So I'm going to start with tiles. I'm just going to hit spacebar and type in tile, and there's tile generators. I'm going to go with a random tile. Let that load up. Click that and drag it into my height. And then from there, I'm going to do an ambient occlusion. Just drag that in, and then drag that into the ambient occlusion dot. Okay, so you'll see how it's doing like a black and white. Now, on this ambient occlusion, I've got the height way too high. You can see how it's was blowing out, and it was thinking like, okay, fill it up. I'm gonna pull that down and probably pull the radius down a little bit. You won't see it at these values too much, but you can adjust that to see how the ambient occlusion will run its pass. So one thing I want you all to make sure, it might not be set by default, so if you go under the renderer, make sure you're not using iRay, that you're using OpenGL. OpenGL is going to be that real-time render. If you are on iframe, you'll see that you'll hit iterations and it's going to be really laggy because it's trying to render this photoreal effect. Just make sure you're on OpenGL because we want real time. We want to be able to work fast, and it's going to be the closest renderer to what we have in Unreal. The other thing I want you to check out is the materials. If you go to default definitions, and we're going to be by default sitting on the physically based material roughness. Now there's two options. There's parallax occlusion, and that's essentially taking the geometry we have and using a texture to fake a transition of parallax. Tessellation actually takes your geometry, multiplies its tessellation factor, and then actually physically protrudes out your surface. So you can see how I've got these little cutouts. The silhouette is actually being geometry cut from my surface. Now if I pull this tessellation factor down, we're not going to get as clean edges. Obviously we're using like squares, but you'll see that our geometry is just not smooth enough. There's not enough vertices to translate what we're trying to do. So if your computer can handle it, kick that up as high as it can go. That way you can get some nice forms going. That, or just stick with, again, you can go back to the material and set it to parallax occlusion, and this one is going to be closest to what we're going to be using inside of Unreal. It'll still give you that depth, but the edges will look really weird. So if you watch me change the scale, you can see how it kind of breathes on the surface, but it's doing just something really weird to those edges. We're not getting that silhouette deformation. You can still use it if it's like forward, front. You still have that depth information in there. So pick whatever you're going to be working with. In this class, we're not going to be going over how to use tessellation in Unreal. It is possible. It is very performance heavy. So depending on your computer, you may be able to use it or not, but we're not going to be going over it this class. All right, now back to making our textures. So you might want to give yourself some room. This graph is going to get kind of big. It always happens. Some ways to keep organized is you can grab your nodes and right click in the background and hit add frame. And what that'll do is it'll allow you to kind of like material editor, it'll give you a frame and like a little container to work in. And then you can come over here and rename it. So I'm just gonna call this like my sculpt. Okay, so some really fun things. Actually, that's not part of my sculpt, that's the ambient occlusion. So I'm gonna do this. You can hit D to dock. And then if you find any of them, you just select it, hit D to undock it. I know that I'm not gonna put anything between here and the base. This is what the end node is before it goes in the base, so I'm just gonna dock it in. So from here, we're gonna put in some different nodes. There's a lot of great nodes. The slope blur node is gonna get used a lot. The blend node is gonna get used a lot. So I'll just give you a glimpse. Actually, I don't want to put that inline, so I'm gonna put slope blur out. I'm gonna get blend node. And there's flood fill and all of its different cool little features with it. So if we do flood fill to gradient, that's one. Another one is flood fill to, let's see, random grayscale. That's another good one. And I'll show you how these nodes all kind of work together. So if you double click on the flood fill, so what a flood fill does is it tries to detect each shape, each continuous shape, and gives it like a UV color ray. So it knows there's an actual solid continuous object. And what that'll allow us to do is we can then give it different parameters on each element. So you can see on here, I'm giving it a slope, a directional slope. On this one, the random color, I can pick out particular ones. If you come over the random seed, it'll kind of change which ones get picked. And I'll show you how this will be useful for masking out specific tiles within here. This one is great. So if you have a lot of like deformation on your tile, tiles are not placed in flat. Nothing is perfect. So this allows you to add that little variation within it. So if you notice, there's a lot of settings. Just get dirty, explore, see what everything does. This particular one will actually change the angle randomly on each of your tiles. This one will just completely rotate each of them. So if we have no angle variation, we could just rotate them specifically all together. And then this one just changes your variation. So you can come in here and you can actually hit Control D and it'll duplicate. So what I'm going to show you now is the blend node. Let's make sure these two are different. We'll do a little variation. And let's just make sure they kind of have a unique look. Now what I can do is, this is much like a Photoshop layer or a set of layers. Like this is your bottom layer, this is the layer above it, and then you have a lot of blend modes. You can do a multiply, so it'll take the two. So if I double click on this node, so I'm viewing it down here, you'll notice if I single click over here, I can access the properties. You'll notice on these badge nodes, this one shows that I'm looking at the property, this one shows that I'm looking at the 2D view, and if you look at these out here, that's showing the 3D view. So with this, in our 2D view and us editing this one, you can watch how the multiply will adjust depending on the angle variation. Now if we come over to here, we have a couple different variations going on. If you want, just plug this straight into your height. And now you can see kind of how, I'll switch this over so you can really see that exaggeration to tessellation. You can see how that surface is really being broken up. You have those different peaks going on throughout the surface. Now if I want to, go through, we can try and check out different angles. If you want to really exaggerate it so it's more like it was cut instead of tilted, you could take like your levels, drop that in, and then just tighten up that angle a little bit. So it's almost a harsh transition. And you can see on some of those how we're really getting that cut in. That obviously might be a little too harsh, but you can really start to kind of chisel away on that. And you could do the same thing for the other one. So you can kind of see where like all of this is going. You're going to get really different results depending on what you're aiming for. You might end up with something that you don't like, but it looks really cool. Just take a snapshot of whatever you're doing and just save it away for another project. And once you can kind of see that we've got this, some of these angles coming in, that might be matching it too much. Again, so you can always come in here and adjust. You can just kind of see how it just ends up, how it like cuts it, blends it. It might be too much. You can go one side, you can go to the other side. Maybe we even come in and just try different effects, different blend modes. Again, you don't know what you're going to end up with. That looks a little wobbly in this case, and you just, again, you don't know what you're going to come up with. Just try them out. Now some things you can even go back to our tile generator. Maybe our indices are too wide. You can come down here and modify them, make it a little tighter. Or if you really want that big organic space, you can get that too. That was a little too much. It just really depends on how you want to tackle that and what you're kind of going for. Also, in this generator, you can, instead of having a square, you can have different discs, shapes. You can even input your own pattern that you created. So for an example, if I came over here and I did a shape, I'm going to change the tiling to absolute and no tiling. And from there, I'm going to use a transform. Transform is much like Photoshop. Can scale it down. And then maybe I want to warp it. Let's do a directional warp. And let's do a shape again. Plug that in, and I'm going to change the shape to a disc. Come over here, run that intensity. Let's see, which direction is the warp happening? Maybe that's too hard cut. We need a parabola kind of transition so you can see how we push more unless, so it's not a hard cut. So I want to add a transform to this one. And maybe we do a thinner transition. I think this needs to be a little bit larger. Again, this one we'll do absolute instead of its parent and no tiling. And so you can kind of see where this is going. If I transform this over, we can see how it's getting affected, how it's wobbling around depending on that warp node. And then in here, if I kick this intensity up and it's not enough, you can always come in here and add more. So if I want it 200, that might be too much, but you're not limited to what this value or this slider has to offer. Now some things might be limited, but not everything. So just go ahead and play. Again, let's just say this is the shape that I want to be using to repeat. I can use this as in my input pattern, and you can see it's going to repeat that pattern, or square instead of our input. I just wanted to show you the what you could do with adding different shapes instead of just using what they have. If you want to get rid of a noodle going inside of one of your nodes, your pins, just hold Alt and click. So another thing I want to show you is this random grayscale, flood to random grayscale. So what this allows me to do is I can zone out and say I only want a specific range. So if I come in here and use a gradient tool, I can remap the darker colors to a different value. So the best way to do it is add an extra node, make it black, and then put it on the other side of the white. So now I can say, I can come in here and zone out the mid grays. So there you can pick one, or you can pick a couple, or maybe if you want the higher sections. And then just remember, you can come back here and change the random scale or the random seed. So you can kind of zone out which ones you want to use. And then just make sure that if you want to tighten them up, if you know you want these, you can come through with another level, and then we can either block those out or whiten out the ones that are selected. Okay. You can also use a contrast too. That'll work almost the same way. It's using a color, so you'll notice there's this gray noodle is for grayscale, and the orange one is for colored. And I'll show you how to convert back and forth. So just if you don't want to use the levels, you can use that contrast. If you kick the contrast way up, you can either go below or go above, and you'll get different results because it says, okay, these gray values are too low for it to pick out that contrast. But with the levels, you can kind of pick and choose. You can tighten it up, and then you can shift the mid value and lower value to knock out. Just make sure you don't flip them over. This is pretty tiny to work with, but you can start knocking out which ones that you want and don't want with the levels. So it works. I think levels particularly has more freedom than the contrast luminosity. So from there, you can do things like, again, the blend. And there's a thing called opacity. That's pretty much your mask. Now you're going to notice sometimes you're going to run into where you need a grayscale to pop in and you have a color. You don't have to worry. There is a color to grayscale node, And it's as simple as that. Sometimes it won't generate anything. If it's not generating it, it's because it has an alpha. You just turn that on and it flattens your image to black and white, and you'll be able to use it. Now what this does is it allows me to say, okay, mask out and do something else with the objects I've picked to mask out. What you can do, let's say we have a couple of those, and I'm going to pop this in. You're going to see that in the height, it's going to knock those out. So you can see in here, they're pushed back. I'm going to go back to our tessellation, to the parallax occlusion, so you can see it clean our edge flow. So those are knocked out. Now I can do something with those. I can either fill them up with something, or I can make them look like they're broken. So if I come in here and do, let's say, like that slope, I never went over the slope. We'll do the slope grayscale, and then I'm going to plug that into there. It's not going to look like anything. It'll look like it was before, but with this, I can now put in like something like a Perlin noise. This is another generator you'll probably use a lot. So you're going to see off the bat, it's going to look like, I don't know, water, really speckly water. Just turn your samples up a lot, and then we're going to bring the intensity down. What this does is it kind of warps those edges. This is probably scaled too much, so you can see what's already happening to our 3D view. Let's go in and pull the scale down a little bit. I just really want to warp those edges a little bit. I'll probably bring that intensity up a bit more again. I'm going to play play with this back and forth. Now we kind of lost our information, but what we're going to do too is we're going to put in what's called an edge detect. And that's going to break up the surface a bit. This is obviously very exaggerated. It's a little bit round. Maybe I'll go back the other way. We'll do an edge detect first, and then we'll run it through the slope blur, and then dump that into there. So just go through, find something that works for you. Some of these values are too high. You can put in blurs to kind of help bring that sharpness down too. Work on levels. There's so many ways you can go around adding variation to your to whatever you're making. Check out tutorials, kind of figure out how people are doing it. If you go on ArtStation and do a search for Substance Designer, you'll find so many cool materials done using Substance Designer, and if you can think of it, you can literally make it in Substance Designer. So you can kind of see how my graph is getting really loaded. You just come in here, grab it. I would consider this is pretty much all of my sculpt. So what I did was went ahead and put a level in. If you notice during my creation process, I was getting that harsh line. It's because I didn't update the ambient occlusion layer. If you just put a levels in place, you can snap it into both. Just don't make any adjustments, and now you only have one node that redirects to two nodes. Eventually you can go in there and modify it how you want. Again, if you watch, I can disable the ambient occlusion, and yeah, you'll see your information, but it doesn't read as well without that ambient occlusion in there. So let's just make sure that you're running the ambient occlusion in correctly, and you can kind of read in that information. So just go through, put some cracks, cuts, just explore, see what happens with things, and just keep playing. This is just my sculpt. You can go ahead and expose like your roughness, and that's going to change drastically how your thing feels. So like here's it's very wet on this one. You can go ahead and see what happens when you throw that roughness in right off the bat. You know, we lost a lot of information on the top level, but let's see, level. What we can do from here is we can pull down that white. I should pull it down from this direction and kind of take away that black, because we're not using metallic or anything that's smooth on this particular thing. If we could probably even invert it. That might be a good one. So you can use a invert grayscale. That way we know that our top surface is going to be a little bit more smooth than our bottom. And then we can go in there and adjust those levels. So if we bring it back, you can kind of see how we have that wetness on top and very dry in the crevice. We can now scale that. So you can either make it more wet, or we can pull that wetness out a little bit, and so it's more of a, more on the peaks rather than the crevice. So again, it's all about experimentation, getting in there and playing around, seeing what works, what doesn't work. Let's see. You can also come in here. If you don't know all the nodes, that's okay. Just go through generators. They have a lot of different noises. There's a lot of different patterns to play with. They have a lot of different adjustments to your nodes. Material filters, you won't really need these unless you're doing, we're not going to do it in this class, you're not going to use bitmap, but there are nodes to kind of help break down. If you do bring in a texture from like textures.com, or maybe you made something in Painter and you wanted to bring it in, it'll help break down that material if it doesn't have its different layers. There's a lot of different other utilities to use within here, but you're not going to use much in the material filter area. It's just going to be filters and generators. So I'm going to just play around with the roughness. Might bring a grunge map in and apply this kind of over the whole surface. See what happens to the look and feel. Again, save out your favorites. I use the invert node a lot. So this might, work for something that's kind of painted. You'll have to obviously, adjust it maybe with the levels again. So once you're happy with what you have, you can start working on your color. Again, it's going to be a back and forth process. You're not going to know exactly what you're doing. It's just you're kind of feeling your way through until you're happy with the results. Obviously, if you don't have something in mind, just constantly check reference images that you kind of want to aim towards, and eventually you'll get there. So the color, again, just go to this base node. We're going to open up that color value. You can see how it's just off the bat, it comes out black. You know, a good node we can use is the gradient tool. We can kind of base it off of here. So what it's saying is on this side, we'll take our blacks, and we're obviously making them black, and taking our whites and making them white. But now what we can do is, instead of having the black, I can go into here, take this black node and make it red. And if I want my whites, I can make them green. So you can see what happens in this gradient remapper. It can be kind of confusing because it shows up as black and white, and you assume, you know, that's the reason. But it's actually a positioning of this scale, and you're telling in that position on the scale what color you want to do. So from here you can use a gradient color picker, and what's really cool about this is it tries to go from your darks to highs and samples a bunch of different colors across your gradient, and it'll remap it. So I'll just give you an example. I'll just, I don't know, come down here and let's see. You can also sample a texture too, instead of just something like this. So if I clicked and dragged, you see how it picked up, like, you know, the orange and the red that I was working with, and remapped it. So I'll come back to this. I'm going to show you how this affects the surface. Maybe what we'll do is we'll go to Google and we will sample, you know, stone. So if you just pull this off to the side, you can actually use your color sample on here. So do this and this. Do gradient, and probably do, remember, go from low to high if you can. And so you can see how it's going to sample different gradients across that surface. You're obviously going to get some weird results depending on how you pull that gradient in, but eventually you get something pretty cool, and then you can go in there and start, you know, clearing out some of these elements to clean up that gradient a little bit. So that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and reopen this up a little bit, and then this is good for just a start. We might want to blend this out a little bit, so I'll do another high quality blur. I've got to get the color high quality. Blur, high quality color blur. Blend this into color. Intensity's a bit high. And then we'll go through and we'll add our high detail color in there as well. And just start, you know, adding different effects. We can, you know, use the grunge. Use our blend node. So you're going to see something again where you can't mix the gray and color together. So when you're going from gray to color, just a gradient map in line will fix that problem. And then you can remap the color of your grunge if you want to. But all I want to really do is just go through and test out some different layer options and see what happens. I'm just going to shift through them. Another cool way to do this is, instead of multiplying it like this, We can get rid of that gradient, put it in opacity, and then just put a uniform color in, just so we know what it's doing. And I'll just start with like, I don't know, dirty brown or something. And then just start from the top and go through our different options again. You know, and if you find something you like, you could probably dial it down a little bit, and play around with that. Obviously, we're getting a little too dark on this. Remember, you got to keep within those PBR value ranges. So if you look at this is a chart. It's available on the FSO site. You'll see that snow should be really white. You know, if we're looking at like bricks or stone somewhere in this, we need to get those values up a little bit higher. You know, some of the darker stuff, it's not going to read as well inside of Unreal. So just keep that in the back of your head. You can come in here, you can either use a levels or HSL value. So each of them are going to do its own kind of thing. You can either pull up, but it's going to wash out your values. If you try to clamp it on here, you might get too much saturation going on, right? So it might not be as convenient to work with a level. Whereas the HSL, you can clamp those values, you can make it brighter, and then give it, you know, your saturation. It's going to be a toss-up. You can also come in with your contrast and luminosity. There's a couple different ways to tackle this. So if you want to bring up that value, add a little bit more contrast, you might have better control over the luminosity with, you know, it depends on which workflow you like better. So this one seems pretty good. We're going to just brighten it up overall. I might want to put a little bit more saturation in there. So that's when HSL will be kind of convenient for you. You can pop that in line and then just pop that saturation in a little bit. If it's too saturated, you can pull it down. Just go through, play with it, figure out what feels right for you. So in this next section, I'm going to show you how to export your substance files. It's relatively easy. Just make sure you save. You can either hit this little up arrow, or you can come down to publish. Publish only means it's exporting. I don't know why they decided to use publish instead of export. But you're going to publish your SBSAR file. It's an archive file. So just save it. Save it where you know you're going to be using it. Let's go through here. You can turn on your pixel size. This way you can adjust. So if you did tailor at that 4K, we can adjust down to a lower size. Just hit OK. Let's go to Unreal. Now we're going to put it inside of our textures because primarily we're generating our textures, and then we can have the option to put the file, have the file generate a material for us, but we can make materials from scratch and then use those substance texture files to make that material. Now if you don't have the substance plugin enabled, you're not going to be able to find that substance file or SBSAR file. You're going to want to come up to Edit and Plugins. It's assuming you downloaded from the Substance directory. Just hit Enable. It needs to restart, so let it go ahead and save and restart. There we go. Now we can go back to that textures and do the import, and it should find the substance file now. Now for the import settings, you can have it create a material for you. If you do have it, make sure you specify the material path, go into materials. just for the cleanliness of our folder structure. Once it finishes importing, you're going to have a green tile, and then this little strip means this is an instance made from this factory. Go ahead and save so it's on your hard drive. All your asterisks should go away. These are all the different maps that were generated using that substance file. So if you double click on your instance, make sure you turn on height. And generally it'll show, you can change the height down here. I'm not sure why it's not showing up this time, but generally you'll see 1024 by 1024, and that'll be available for you to change. So go ahead and hit save. You'll see the height map pops in, and close that down. Now if you want a different variation or something like that, you can right click this and create a graph instance. What that is good for is if you have exposed variables and you can change the seeding on some things, you can do that. So I'll go ahead. I know we already created some seeds, or there's some generated seeding on different, some of those different nodes, like that Perlin noise, and I think it might even change the layout of the other tiles that are generated, but we'll see what this gives us. So on that new instance, you can come in here and randomize that seed and hit save, and you're gonna possibly see a difference in the files. Let's see. Make sure you check that on. So you can see it changed which tiling I was using. It changed completely the stone and just all the different seeding options. And what that allows us to do is create a material that's very much alike, but it uses a whole different structure and rebuilds you a whole brand new texture. So this way we don't have repeating across a whole surface, like a large surface, and we have different tiles. So you can go ahead, and if you have these files, I'm gonna go over to here, and on my base, I'm gonna apply this material straight to there, hit save, and you'll see where these specific walls are. It's gonna update with this tile once it generates. Now it's looking pretty flat. The way we can get that bump out and fix the tiling, we can come in here. It generated all the maps for us. But what we can do is, first I'd like to put in a bump offset node. And then we'll do a texture coordinate. Texture coordinates allow you to do your tiling. It also controls your bump offset. You need that coordinate so you can get that surface deformation going on. So just plug these into the UV of each of these maps. It's going to complain. We'll address that here in a second. And what you'll also notice, it didn't bring in the height map because it doesn't have a slot on the actual material to use it. It's going to be used in our bump offset. So if you come over, we're going to bring in our original height. Just drag and drop in one of the channels. We'll keep applying this, and that'll make that error go away, by the way. I was just looking for a second value. Go ahead and hit save. And then from there, you can kind of see how the surface giving us a little deformation. We can push that even further on here. Let's try 0.1. Go ahead and save. Now, if you want to make adjustments to your material without having to sit here and save asset, well, what we can do is we can expose some parameters, and then we can adjust the values in a material instance. So go ahead and hit, on this one, we're just going to play with the height ratio. Just hold 1 and click. It'll give you a single constant. Drag that in there. And then on here, we're going to right click, convert to parameter. I'm going to change this to height intensity. Go ahead and save, and we can close that. Then inside of materials, if you have a bright green one, just right click and you can create material instance, much like the substance designer file. Call it matte. Tiles. And then from in there, we can adjust the height. We can come down here and select that height. And then we can start playing with that value to see how it deforms. Okay, just hit save. Let's go to our mesh again. We're going to apply that material. Didn't really name it very good, did I? So now you can get some of that height in there. It might be easier to see it where the light is actually deforming the surface. You can see where that specularity is. So if you let that height manipulate that surface, you can go in here and adjust how far that's going to come off the surface. Now this is just a really cheap trick to kind of get that height information in. You see this brick essentially is parallaxing faster than the stuff in the back. If you really want a lot of depth, you can go through and build a tessellated material. I'm not going to show you, but you can look online if you really want that depth. But again, keep in mind, it's very performance heavy. This is just to give you a little sample of what it might look like. So on this, I didn't go over tiling either. If you go back into your original material, you can actually come here in your texture coordinate. You can adjust the tiling. So if this is supposed to be 2, we can save that and it'll update to all of our instances. There you go. And let's say this is just, it's not stretched out enough. You can, they don't have to be uniform on the U and V. Let's say our U should probably be 1.5. Hit save. Don't forget to plug your coordinate into your height map, otherwise they'll be unaligned. So there again, you can see how I have some height information being generated. It's not going to be perfect because if you really come up there and you have a lot, you'll have this like artifact happening. But it's for just a little bit of height information that's happening, some easy transitions. It just gives you some real height on it. Something to keep in mind too, let's say this looks too dark. Now there's a reason why we're keeping in those PBR value ranges. It's primarily because of our lighting. Our lighting drastically affects how things look. So if I had this and I turned off Effects World and then I rebaked, this wall will look drastically different. We might have to adjust some of these values in here. So your scene might end up looking like this. It's going to be really dark, and then you're going to think, okay, well, my textures are too dark. That's not the case. So if you come over to Lit and do lighting only, you can see how dark your scene actually is. Make sure you hit G. It'll try to do the adaptive brightness, but if you look at, let's do lighting with detail, you can see how the adaptive brightness is affecting how our scene looks. So if I look at something that's not bright, it's going to brighten up. If I look at something bright, everything else is going to darken up. So keep that in mind too, that your post-process effect is being a factor. If you hit G, it's going to give you more of the range without that adaptive brightness. So just keep that in mind. Make sure to just brighten up your lights to where they should be. And you're going to notice after you do a few bakes that your lighting will help bring out the brightness in your material rather than you try to adjust your material to accommodate for that darkness. So just go back to Designer, make some materials. You need at least 5 of them. Make sure that you're exporting them out of Designer and that you're double checking that they look right inside of your Unreal project. Now this week, you don't have to apply your materials to your texture. You don't have to apply the materials to your models, but I would like you at least testing them, making sure they work well. The last week is really going to be about look and feel. We're going to be going over lighting. We're going to be going over post-process effects and how to really wrap up your scene and make it just look gorgeous, and that the textures work with the lighting, they work with the meshes, and it's going to be a lot of back and forth between your meshes, your materials, and your lighting.